Ever since the original title debuted in 1998, the series Metal Gear Solid by Hideo Kojima has innovated a signature blend of spy action and paranoiac science fiction. Heavily influenced by the production of Stanley Kubrick's monolithic 2001: A Space Odyssey, Kojima often takes his sci-fi and speculative fiction to heights beyond the realm of the visible and the immediate, creating what are, in fact, entire standalone worlds with their own inner logic. Their poetry closely synced as Kojima's interpretations with our own. In this video, we'll be discussing the real-world 1976 landmark book that most fundamentally informs the entire Metal Gear Solid series as science fiction, Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. By the end, it'll hopefully be a little more clear how brilliantly MGS frames very real-world concepts imported from science, technology, and philosophy in creative and expressive ways.
Have you ever heard of the asymmetry theory? Nature tends to favor asymmetry. Those species which have gone extinct all show signs of symmetry. The genome soldiers suffer from the same problem, signs of symmetry. So do I. As do you. That's right. We are all on the verge of death at the genetic level. We don't know when or what type of disease will occur. That's why we need the old man's genetic information.
You want Big Boss's DNA so you can save your family? It's very touching.
In nature, family members don't mate with each other, and yet they help each other to survive. Do you know why? It increases the chance that their genes will be passed on to a new generation. Altruism among blood relatives is a response to natural selection. It's called the selfish gene theory.
You're telling me that your genes are ordering you to save the genome soldiers?
You can't fight your genes. It's fate. All living things are born for the sole purpose of passing on their parents' genes. That's why I'll follow what my genes tell me. And then I'm going to go beyond, in order to break the curse of my heritage.
The selfish gene was a major contribution to biology and a crown jewel in what would later be christened the Information Age. Zoologist Richard Dawkins reconceptualized the principles of Darwinian selection, boiling down all of life's inherent patterns and cycles as simply processes of information. Whether in the realm of genes or in culture, in reality or even simulation, Dawkins identified the underlying essential properties of information as such, which courses and flows directionally almost as a form of life, the most essential building block of which Dawkins calls not the gene at all, but the replicator. Prior to Dawkins, debate existed where the focus or focal point of evolution even took place. Every prevailing theory, such as on the species, group, or even individual level, contained contradictions. Biology wasn't yet sure how to explain naturally occurring patterns of behavior that seemed to challenge or contradict Darwin, as Darwin was then, in the mid-70s, understood. Something that Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain would bring up is the worker honeybee, for example, which evolved to sacrifice itself for the good of the hive. Animals don't always follow the formula of strict self-interest.
I'll let you decide the best COA. I'm counting on you, Snake.
Yet that's precisely natural selection's most basic axiom, that evolution, as a process, has for its driver competition among self-interests. Dawkins' brilliance was seeing that if animals themselves aren't always selfish, maybe that proves the real zone of selection operates lower down, microscopically, between the real contestants and candidates, our genes. We, Dawkins, dismisses the individuals as mere meat robots. Vehicles housing what really matter, those replicators, in this case, the genes.
From the beginning, the Pentagon was just using you as a vector.
As the title might give away, what brings all this together is the question of selfishness versus altruism. On the surface, the existence of altruism, not only in humans, but also observable even in non-human primates and other organisms, it seemed to challenge the principles of natural selection that I mentioned as a process directed by, at bottom, competition between forms of self-interest. Dawkins says, to the contrary, that altruism is a case of self-interest, just not that of the individual. It is the gene complex underpinning that individual's altruistic behavior that has survived and proliferated on the basis of its own self-interest, and selfishly, even at the cost of the well-being of its host.
You don't mean Big Boss.
That's right. We've been working feverishly to identify the genes responsible for his incredible combat skill. So far, we've discovered about 60 of the so-called soldier genes.
So his body was recovered after all.
Yes, and his cells have remained frozen in a cryo chamber. His genomic information is a priceless treasure to mankind.
Priceless to the military, perhaps.
His body was burned severely, but it was possible to restore his DNA profile from just a single strand of his hair.
You people are amazing. And then you're gonna transplant those genes into soldiers?
Yes. We'll use a process that I discovered called gene targeting. It's your genes. They make you predisposed towards violence.
You really like talking about genes, Naomi.
Dawkins' mind-blowing revelation was that the information encoded in DNA is truly digital and truly selfish. That this digital quality makes this information eternal, as the most basic indivisible form of what Dawkins calls the basis for all life, the replicator. And like its replicator founding fathers back in the primeval ooze, the gene, and then as we'll see according to Dawkins, its heir, the meme, selfishly propagate even at the expense of their hosts. Replicators, information strands, such as genes or memes, are the real focus of evolution for Dawkins. We so-called individuals, then, are merely, as I said, the replicator's vehicles, meat robots, for safeguarding their process of transmission and variation from one generation to the next. And since the logic of life runs circular, the purpose, so to speak, of life is life itself. The gene itself, as well as the meme, has a kind of essential underlying drive to proliferate themselves, even, and here's what's key, at the expense of their hosts, you or me. Though most of the time the two roles of replicator and vehicle, Dawkins explains, can be symbiotic, as altruism illustrates, their forms of self-interest don't always overlap. And more often than not, whether we're talking about memes or genes, replicators, when it comes to us vehicles housing them, they tend to be parasites, pure and simple. Or at least if this interpretation is correct.
Why are you telling me this?
I can read people's minds. In my lifetime, I have read the pasts, presents, and futures of thousands upon thousands of men and women.
Oh, gross.
And each mind that I peered into was stuffed with the same single object of obsession. That selfish and atavistic desire to pass on one's seed. It was enough to make me sick. Every living thing on this planet exists to mindlessly pass on their DNA. We're designed that way. And that's why there is war. But you are different. You're the same as us. We have no past, no future. We live in the moment. That's our only purpose. Humans weren't designed to bring each other happiness. From the moment we're thrown into this world, we're fated to bring each other nothing but pain and misery. The first person whose mind I dove into was my father's. I saw nothing but disgust and hatred for me in his heart. My mother died in childbirth, and he despised me for it. I thought my father was going to kill me. That's when my future disappeared. I lost my past as well. When I came to, the village was engulfed in flames.
Are you saying that you burned your village down to bury your past?
I see that you have suffered the same trauma. We are truly the same, you and I. The world is a more interesting place with people like you in it. I never agreed with the boss's revolution. His dreams of world conquest do not interest me. I just wanted an excuse to kill as many people as I could.
You monster.
Let him talk. He doesn't have much time left.
I've seen true evil. You, Snake, you're just like the boss. No, you're worse. Compared to you, I'm not so bad.
How did the selfish gene fit into MGS1? Well, the game mentioned the book by name, as well as its relevance to altruism repeatedly, themed as the game was around the subject of genetic transmission and variation of nature versus nurture. If anything, the game shows the robots and the replicators inside them coming into frequent conflict. The essential fact of the human condition, as far as MGS1 is concerned, seems to be the struggle between our free individual will and genetic destiny. The vehicles and the replicators. Nearly every character arc and dynamic in the game illustrates this well.
My grandfather was part of the Manhattan Project. He suffered with the guilt for the rest of his life. And my father, he was born on August 6th, 1945.
The day of the Hiroshima bomb. God's got a sense of humor, all right.
3 generations of Emmerich men. We must have the curse of nuclear weapons written into our DNA.
But as covered by the second game, Sons of Liberty, we humans are the byproducts of not only one form of replicator, our genes, but 2.
This situation, I find it very nostalgic.
Where am I?
Why, inside Arsenal Gear, of course. Actually, we're also inside the memory of Shadow Moses.
Jack, I found data on the briefcase used to unlock the nuclear launch codes. It appears to be a fail-safe system using the President's DNA base order and input of his physiological data as its key. The lock is said to be impenetrable.
In other words, the President himself is the only one who can enter the password.
Right. On top of that, as Ames mentioned before, the password becomes invalid when the President's brainwaves, heartbeat, etc. are not within normal limits.
So the President entered that code by his own free will after all. But why would the US President lend a hand to terrorists?
If everything is ultimately just a form of replicating information, well then logically humanity exists from the evolution not just of genes, but also of culture. Dawkins penned the word mimeme or meme to mean simply that which is copied or imitated as culture, or say technology.
The gene is immortal. In fact, a publisher once, when I showed him the first couple of chapters of The Selfish Gene, said you shouldn't call it that, you should call it the immortal gene. And perhaps I should have done. Genes are immortal in the sense that the coded information they contain is reproduced, is replicated with almost total fidelity, significantly, not absolutely total fidelity, generation after generation after generation, such that there are genes which are identical to what they were tens of millions of years ago, hundreds of millions of years ago in a few cases.
The data of life is transferred from parent to child. That's how it works. But we have no heirs, no legacy. We brothers are called les enfants terribles. Cloned from our father, with the ability to reproduce conveniently engineered out. What is our legacy if we cannot pass the torch?
He argues the meme is the Replicator 3.0, following the gene and the pre-gene form of replication that presumably went on in the primordial soup when life began in the ocean 4 billion years ago. The first replicators and founding fathers of life on Earth.
Who are you?
To begin with, we're not what you'd call human. Over the past 200 years, a kind of consciousness formed layer by layer in the crucible of the White House. It's not unlike the way life started in the oceans 4 billion years ago. The White House was our primordial soup, a base of evolution. We are formless. We are the very discipline and morality that Americans invoke so often. How can anyone hope to eliminate us? As long as this nation exists, so will we.
Cut the crap! If you're immortal, why would you take away individual freedoms and censor the net?
Jack, don't be silly.
Don't you know that our plans have your interests, not ours, in mind?
What?
Jack, listen carefully, like a good boy.
The mapping of the human genome was completed early this century. As a result, the evolutionary log of the human race lay open to us.
We started with genetic engineering, and in the end, we succeeded in digitizing life itself.
But there are things not covered by genetic information.
What do you mean?
Human memories, ideas, culture, history.
Genes don't contain any record of human history.
Is it something that should not be passed on? Should that information be left at the mercy of nature?
We've always kept records of our lives, through words, pictures, symbols, from tablets to books.
But not all the information was inherited by later generations. A small percentage of the whole was selected and processed, then passed on. Not unlike genes, really.
That's what history is, Jack.
But in the current digitized world, trivial information is accumulating every second, preserved in all its triteness, never fading, always accessible.
Rumors about petty issues, misinterpretations, slander.
All this junk data, preserved in an unfiltered state, growing at an alarming rate.
It will only slow down social progress, reduce the rate of evolution.
Right. You seem to think that our plan is one of censorship.
Are you telling me it's not?
You're being silly. What we propose to do is not to control content, but to create context.
Create context?
The digital society furthers human flaws and selectively rewards development of convenient half-truths.
Dawkins speculated that, inductively, the new replicator, the meme, has supplanted and even hijacked the primacy for humans of the old, so that, to quote Susan Blackmore in Contemporary Debates in Philosophy of Biology, things like language, music, and technology are all parasites, often turned symbiotic, that evolved for their own sake and not for the sake of individual humans or their genes. In this, of course, the meme is merely mimicking the action of its analog, the gene, just as Dawkins' theory would suggest it might.
It's not power I want. What I wanted to take back from the Patriots are things like freedom, civil rights, opportunities. The founding principles of this country.
We can leave behind much more than just DNA. Through speech, music, literature, and movies, what we've seen, heard, felt, anger, joy, and sorrow. These are the things I will pass on. That's what I live for. We need to pass the torch and let our children read our messy and sad history by its light. We have all the magic of the digital age to do that with. The human race will probably come to an end sometime, and new species may rule over this planet. Earth may not be forever, but we still have the responsibility to leave what traces of life we can. Building the future and keeping the past alive are one and the same thing.
The The ways these topics like memetics, altruism, and the selfish gene all interact with the writing and design of MGS 1 and 2 are as complex as they are immense. Sometimes this can happen through well-established sci-fi tropes, like the use of genetic clones, but other times they show up unexpectedly, like in a last-minute protagonist swap, in MGS2's case, or 5's case, to show, not tell, directly the principle of information, all information from genes to memes, having in some sense a life of its own. While naive characters like Hal Otacon Emmerich believe truth and reason and fairness will win out if information is just allowed its wish to be and to remain flowing free, or that science can be merely neutral and not an active byproduct and influence on a particular kind of society, how that society gets ruled and how it construes itself.
It's not just the PMCs either. Every corporation tethered to the military-industrial complex is losing its sense of morality. And it's us science-holics who are doing their dirty work for them, not even realizing it.
Information, just like selfish genes, has its own direction, we see. One entirely outside questions of we the people's self-interest, yet one that also cannot be, strictly speaking, considered neutral. In marked contradiction against the prevailing assumptions behind, say, the American Revolution, or the shift towards open information societies, all of which took place over the last 3 or so centuries, at least according to this series by way of Kojima's interpretation of Dawkins. In Dawkins' view of memetics, there is no marketplace of ideas per se, no guarantee, in other words, that good, let alone true information will outsurvive and outcompete the bad. Fights between the self-interest of individuals and their wider twin sets of information pools are really at the core of MGS's science fiction, just as they are at the core of Dawkins' view of biology, and in all cases we're seeing extremely selfish fights, derived from nature, but very much descriptive of human beings. So too might we describe the fight we see in Metal Gear Solid between the interaction of our biology and our psychology, or to put it another way, the struggle between reality itself and our attempts to perceive it while remaining part of it at the same time. In MGS3 Snake Eater, biology and heredity became truly front and center subjects as we played through a kind of Edenic origin story revealing the mother spring for all of our memes so far, the originally replicated analogs, the series' founding mothers and fathers, its primary causers. If one struggle continues to reassert itself in Kojima's saga, it is this: the struggle of the replicator to maintain itself in symmetry or fecundity over time, and the struggle of the meat robot's survival, which seems to depend, conversely, on precisely the opposite, on asymmetry and diversity, not uniformity. This cuts to the wick of the problem of why life replicates itself in an inaccurate way, not simply creating exact clones or copies, but through the process of genetic variation. As MGS1 explains via the clone Liquid Snake, genetically speaking, signs of symmetry come as a death sentence. Host survival often depends on wider ancestral data sets than this. Data pools built of more combat-tested, diverse, and multivarigated traits, which can spurn survival against ever more of life's inherent dangers, pitfalls, and sudden accidents. Contrast this with the individual gene or replicator itself, which of course can only survive by maintaining at least a rough fecundity, a symmetry with its former and future selves. That is, after all, the definition of genetic life over the eons. Such inner struggle, inner conflict, it might help explain human nature, help explain bad things according to MGS like, say, royal inbreeding or even genocide, but also good things like all of human culture, love and patriotism. Like MGS3, all the way to MGS5 will showcase, we are all in some sense split in two. Split between the drives to survive for the robot and the drives to selfishly survive for the replicators. To evolve, yet to persist in longevity. And of course all these subjects, and related ones, including the genetic predisposition for aging and death, the paradox of pacifism, not to mention the theory of memes or ideas as a form of mental parasite or virus, they'd continue to directly inform the spy sci-fi series Metal Gear Solid to the very end. MGS may be over and Dawkins' famous book may be super old, but there's no question for its era, if not in a timeless sense, the MGS saga revolutionized a new form of science fiction by fusing together scientific questions and philosophy with cutting-edge storytelling and game design. And in the end, as every Metal Gear would tell us in one form or another, it doesn't necessarily matter so much why we do the things we do, as much as we take the leap into faith and actually do them. Actually live life as we choose and freely, to the extent that we can freely, decide to. Until next time, boss.